while since I've done a video lecture, and so here I am. What we've been talking about is the different aspects of the executive branch. We've looked at the different departments and independent agencies and commissions and all those fun things. What we're going to be looking at today is where does the federal government get all that money to do all these things, to have all these people, to have all these programs? And so today's video, I try to make it as easy as I can, but it's complicated. But today's video is about financing the government and paying for all these things. Now, it's really important, if you haven't read Section 3 yet, stop this video and go back and read it. And it's not all that long, but you need to read it so you have at least a little bit of an idea of what I'm talking about. So if you haven't read it, stop here and read it, then come back to me. How does the government get all this money? Well, a big portion is through taxes. The 16th Amendment gave the federal government the power to collect income taxes, which is a tax on someone's income, a tax on someone's job earnings. About half of the federal government's money that it brings in, its revenue, is through taxes. Now, our tax is what we call a progressive tax because the tax rate, or the more you make, the more taxes you pay. So the lowest wage earners pay the smallest tax, whereas the richest wage earners pay a higher tax. And we have different tax rates or tax brackets depending on how much money you make. You may pay 0, 10, 15, 20, 23%, 27%, 32%. We have about 7 different tax brackets that you can fall into. And the more money you make, the higher tax you pay. And we call that a progressive tax. That's income tax. We have something else called a payroll tax. And a payroll tax is if you have a job, take a look at the back of your check. Part of it is going to say, if you look under the withholdings, part of it's going to say federal tax and state tax. That's income. Then you're going to see some things called SSI or Medicare or Social Security. Those are called payroll taxes because they withhold that money from your check. The federal government gets about 1/3 of its income from payroll taxes. Social Security is actually a regressive tax because the lower wage earners actually pay a greater percentage of their income than higher wage earners. So it hurts the poorer wage earners. And what happens with the Social Security tax? We pay 6.25% of our wage to Social Security, to this retirement account. But that only goes up to about $200,000 of our wages. After that, it cuts off. And so let's say I make $1 million a year. I wish I made $1 million a year. Well, only the first $200,000 or so is taxed at 6.25%. After that, it's not taxed. So that's why it's called a regressive tax, because the poorer people are going to pay, in a sense, a greater percent of their income than I would. We have a Medicare tax that pays for this health insurance. Medicare is what we call a proportional tax, where it doesn't matter how much money you make, everyone pays the same rate, which is a couple percent. There's other ways that the federal government pays for its money. If you notice the payroll taxes and income tax, it only adds up to about 75% or so, 85% or so of our federal revenue. There's other sources. We have excise taxes and tariffs, which are a tax on imports. We have the estate tax, where if you have a lot of property and you die, your heirs have to pay a tax. and we call it the estate tax. Some people call it the death tax. But you have to have a lot of money and a lot of property. It's about $11 million. If you have more than $11 million in property and land and all that, then you're going to be taxed. If you have only $5 million, you're not going to be hit with the estate tax. We also have the gift tax. If someone gives you money, then depending on the amount, you're going to have to pay a gift tax. Someone can give you, let's say my mom and dad want to give me $5,000 as a gift. That's fine. It's not going to be taxed. It's only going to be taxed if it hits $20,000 or more. So most of us, including me, don't have to worry about a gift tax. But that is a tax on a gift on a large sum of money. And the reason why we have that is the federal government doesn't want people just giving their money to older people, giving their money to their kids to avoid the estate tax. They can't say, oh, here's $50,000, here's $100,000, here's $100,000 in order to avoid paying the estate tax. So we have the gift tax to just prevent people from having to pay the estate tax. There's other sources of revenue. If you go to a national park, you have to pay an entrance fee. That money goes to the federal government. And then the federal government, through the Federal Reserve System, loans money to banks. And then banks have to pay an interest, have to pay a fee for that loan. Well, that's money that the federal government gets. If you take a look at this, the federal government gets about half its money from income taxes, a third or so from the payroll tax. We have the corporate income tax, which is the tax on corporations. And then we have those other taxes that make up 8 or 10%. Well, sometimes the revenue that we bring in isn't enough to cover all our expenses. So what do we have to do? We have to borrow money. And there's different ways that the federal government can borrow money. And the easiest, biggest way is through a bond. And a bond is a certificate, in a sense. It's an IOU that the federal government borrows money from you. And they can borrow money from an individual or through a mutual fund or whatever. Other banks could buy it. Other countries could buy a bond. And basically what a bond is, it's a loan. And we have different numbers, different or varying amounts of a bond. And let's just say $1,000. So we have $1,000 bond, and the federal government says, you loan us $1,000, and we promise to pay you that money back plus interest in 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever. And that bond is that certificate. That's the IOU. I have here an example. Now, I know it's going to be backwards for you guys, or I think it's going to be backwards. This is a savings bond. This is my old address, so you can go on and TP that house. I don't care. Just joking. But here's a savings bond, and I covered up everything from it. But what this is that's a $50 loan. I loan the government money, and in return, the federal government says, we promise to pay you that money back plus interest. I think a lot of us have a savings bond. Maybe grandma gave it to us when we were born or on our 10th birthday or something like that. If you have one of those, the government owes you money. They issued a bond to you. And so that's how the government gets that extra money. All that loaning of money, all that borrowing of money adds up. And it adds up into what we call the national debt or the federal debt. Our federal debt today is in the trillions of dollars. We're looking at, due to COVID, this is not an updated number right here, but due to COVID, we're in about the $25 trillion. That's right. The United States owes about $25 trillion. We've borrowed so much money that's how much we owe back. We have to pay it back somehow. And it's a difficult situation. And our assignment tomorrow actually tries to go through this, and we try to balance our budget. We try to spend less and borrow less. And right now, we owe so much money that we spend about $400 billion a year only on interest, only on borrowing. No, we're not even paying back that money with $400 billion. What we're doing is we're just making the interest payments. It's like on a credit card where you make the monthly minimum payment. That's what we're doing here. And it's $400 billion. That's about 10% of our budget. Imagine if we weren't in debt. $400 billion. We could take that money, that's $400 billion every year, that we could take and basically health insurance for everybody, free college for everybody. And we'd be at that, but we are in debt so much, we're paying hundreds of billions of dollars every year just to make the minimum monthly payments, just to make the interest payments on that. So that's crazy. And it's hard to imagine $25 trillion. Just think $25 trillion. I can't count that high. Well, the other side of revenue is spending. And there's two different types of spending, mandatory and discretionary. Mandatory spending is money that we are required by law to spend. It's mandatory. We must do it. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, those are all required. We must do this. Today, about 70% of our budget is through mandatory spending. So 70% of our budget is already accounted for. We can't change it. And so what we can change is the discretionary spending, this other 30% or so. If it's discretionary, it's in a sense optional, where it's not required by law to do it. And Congress decides where to spend that discretionary money. And because there's so little discretionary money, there's always a huge debate. What are we going to spend it on? And so that's the debate that always goes on. We only have this much money to spend. What are we going to do with the rest? 70% is mandatory. Take a look at this. You're going to need to pause this video and just take a look at all the expenses and the different things that we spend money on. This is a pretty accurate number. We borrow, before COVID, about $1 trillion a year is what we've been borrowing. And so each year, our national debt's been going up by more than $1 trillion. We have to look at all these other things, these huge things. Health and Human Services, that's $1,250, so $1.2 trillion. Why is Health and Human Services so expensive? It's the health insurance, Medicare and Medicaid. The DOD, right here, that's the defense. We spend about $650 to $700 billion a year on the military. And you look down at all these other things, that's where we spend our money. So pause it, take a look at it. It's pretty interesting where our money goes. Here's another one that looks at mandatory and discretionary spending. Go on and pause this and read through it. It's kind of interesting. Now what I want to get into is something that's a little complicated. And these are two different types of policies. We have fiscal policy and monetary policy. This deals with money and everything associated with money. And so what we have to understand is that anything that the government does, increasing taxes, decreasing taxes, increasing spending, decreasing spending, borrowing more money, borrowing less money, can cause a change in our economy. If we decrease taxes, well, I would have more money in my pocket, which means I could spend more, which could theoretically improve the economy. If the government decides to spend less, well, they're buying less things. They're giving their people are going to have less money to spend. So if the government spends less, the economy could go down. And then increasing taxes. If the government, and this is think about this, if the government increases taxes, that means I have less money to spend, but the government has more money to spend. And so all these things can change the economy. And sometimes they can have a huge positive effect, and sometimes they can have a huge negative effect. Now, like I said, there's two different types of policies, fiscal and monetary. Fiscal policy is when we talk about taxes in the budget, spending money is uh, spending money and taxes is fiscal policy. That's pretty easy to understand. Monetary policy is a little bit more difficult. Monetary policy deals with the federal government increasing or decreasing the amount of money in circulation, increasing or decreasing the interest rates. That's monetary policy. And the Federal Reserve System deals with the monetary policy. The fiscal policy, that's more of Congress's and the president's domain. But both of these things go hand in hand. They both deal with money in the economy. Every year, the president has to put together a budget. The president starts that process. He has the help of an office called the Office of Management and Budget, and they help the president in creating a budget. The president sends that budget to Congress, and then Congress does what it wants. That's really what happens. But Congress determines where they're going to spend that money. The president sends the blueprint, but then Congress works out the rest or does what they want, and then sends that back to the president where the president can sign it, or he can veto the budget if he wants. There's different rules, and I'm just going to let you read through this. Basically, it's just the ins and outs of budgeting. It goes through Congress and the different parts as different parts of Congress. But pause it, read through this, and then we'll pick up in a second. Okay, hopefully you've read through this last slide. One thing that I do want to talk about is with the monetary policy. Every time they do something, every time with fiscal policy something happens, that's going to change the economy. Imagine if the federal government, through monetary policy, decides to increase interest rates. Well, that means it's going to be more expensive for me to borrow money. And if interest rates go up, I may say, I don't want to buy a house right now because interest rates are going up. So I'm not going to buy a house. Well, that's going to affect the economy. But if the government lowers the interest rate, I'm like, it's a really good time. Interest rates are low. I may buy a car. And so you have to think about that. And then with inflation, inflation is when prices go up. Think about if the government tries to, through its monetary policy, cause inflation to slow down. They may decrease the amount of money that's in circulation. If there's less money in circulation, that could slow things down or slow down inflation. Or if inflation's low, they want to jumpstart the economy, they can push more money out into circulation. So there's more money out there to spend. This is pretty complicated. And if you haven't read Section 3 after I told you to do so before, read through it again or read through it for the first time. If you have any questions, ask me. We have a couple assignments that are going to deal with the budget and monetary and fiscal policy. So if you don't get it yet, just hang tight. Our assignments later on the week will go through that. But if you have any questions in the meantime or even after the assignments, just shoot me an email and I'll try to explain it a little bit better. Until next time, have a good day.